I always suspected that everything in life was not as smooth as it might seem at first glance. Over time, my doubts turned into certainties. I knew about my wife's infidelities. She, my once tender life partner, was secretly weaving threads of other people's passion behind my back. Her secret lover turned out to be my boss, a man who, at first glance, seemed respectable and honorable. He was a full 20 years older than her, an age that I naively assumed would inspire reverence and awe, but as it turned out, it only served to inflame her interest. This man, who had once been my role model and support in business, had shamelessly used his position to conceal his treacherous affair with my wife. He masterfully planned everything so that his every move seemed innocent and justified. Whenever I went on another business trip, it was not an accident, but a deliberate maneuver. Every time I was sent thousands of kilometers away from home, it was not for the good of the cause, but so that they would have time and space for their treacherous games. In my home, under my most secure and sacred shelter, things happened that I could not have imagined at the time. My wife and my boss, a man I trusted, took advantage of the time I was away to shamelessly romp in our bed, the very bed where our shared dreams and plans had once been born. Every business trip, every trip they sent me on under the pretext of important work, was really just a screen for their unholy passion. He was married, like me, which made the whole thing even more ironic. This man, so experienced in life and business, knew how to manipulate not only circumstances but also people. He managed to masterfully put my guard down so that I could not even think about what was going on behind my back. He did it with a subtlety and cunning that was not immediately apparent. He showered me with money. My salary was increasing. Bonuses were becoming almost commonplace, and it all seemed like a well-deserved reward for the labor I put into my work. I was lulled into an illusion of stability and success. I, at first elated by this generous attention, perceived his tokens of gratitude as recognition of my professional merits. How could I not trust a man who seemed to appreciate and respect my labor? He was someone to be respected and looked up to. This thought overshadowed everything else. I worked hard, believing I was building not only a career but a future for my family, while in reality my life was falling apart. But the truth always finds a way to come out, even when it's tried to be buried under a pile of lies and hypocrisy. Half of my coworkers in the office knew what was going on, but they kept quiet. They pretended not to notice, perhaps out of fear of losing their place, or perhaps out of loyalty to the chief who was so generous with his gifts. Everyone had their own reasons for keeping quiet. They watched from the sidelines, knowing that I, like a naive actor, continued to play my part in this play, unaware of the hidden backstage. However, in this tangled web of betrayal, there was one person who couldn't take it. Her best friend, the one who had been her accomplice for months, secretly covered up her affairs and perhaps even felt a sense of power holding the key to her secret. In the end, she was the one who had decided to betray her, not out of nobility, but perhaps out of jealousy, frustration, or simple fatigue with the endless pretense. I was struck to the heart by how skillful an actress she turned out to be. Her skill in deceit and pretense was so perfect that during our years together, I never once suspected her of infidelity. We lived many years together, and I always saw her as an exemplary companion, a devoted wife, mother of our son, the woman with whom I made my plans and dreams. She seemed to be the very support on which you could rely in everything. But, as it turned out, behind this external mask was a lie, mixed with intrigue and betrayal. Our son was 8 years old at the time, and every time I looked at his bright, still childishly naive face, my heart shrank with pain. How could she, his mother, ruin it all? It seemed that her perfidy knew no bounds. She played the role of a caring wife and loving mother, easily maintaining the illusion of family comfort as if nothing had happened. In her eyes, in her words, there was not a single hint of the sordid drama that was unfolding behind my back. And I, gripped by deep trust and love, was blind to the game, blind to the cold calculation in her every gesture. When the truth suddenly came to the surface, an anger surged through my veins that I could barely control. My first reaction was an unbridled desire to rip off that mask, to shatter it with a merciless blow. I wanted to storm into my boss's office and smash his face in, to cripple the man who had destroyed my home, who had humiliated me not only as a husband, but as a man to whom he owed his trust. I was overwhelmed by a burning rage so intense that every moment of restraint seemed like an eternity. But even more unbearably, the other half of that frenzied desire was directed toward her, the woman I had once loved. She stood at the center of all this tragedy, and all I wanted to do at that moment was to throw her out of our lives, to banish her forever from our home, which she had desecrated by her treachery. It seemed that in an instant all our years together had lost their meaning, crumbled like a house of cards. But I could hardly contain myself. Anger, rage, and hatred raged through me like a storm, threatening to destroy everything around me, but something kept me from doing anything rash. 3 years is a long time, a time that can change many things: the nature of feelings, the strength of desires, even life itself. I waited those 3 years, patiently and calculatingly, without a shadow of suspicion. Like an experienced chess player, I built my game, carefully thinking through every move. Outwardly, I remained the same husband, father, and worker that I had been before the truth was revealed. Every morning I got up, got down to business, worked with diligence, even with redoubled energy. But behind that diligence was my plan, cold, deliberate, and ruthless. I had learned to wear the mask I had been a stranger to before. Now my every look, my every word was calculated. I played the part of the loving and imperturbable husband, maintaining the very semblance of marital happiness she had once created. The more I knew, the more skillful I became in the art of pretense, and this was not so much out of fear or weakness as for my ultimate goal. I needed time, time to make my way to freedom, to leave without anyone suspecting, so that my disappearance would be sudden to her and to all those who saw me as the same deceived husband. I worked hard, immersing myself in my work with redoubled vigor. In the eyes of others, I became even more diligent, dedicated, successful. My boss, the very person who was the cause of all this drama, saw me as an ideal subordinate, even a friend. I was able to gain his trust so deeply that he never suspected my true game for a second. I accepted generous bonuses from him, worked on the projects he trusted me with, not knowing that every step he took only brought me closer to the end. While on the outside I was living my old life, on the inside I was building a whole new one. Secretly from everyone, especially my wife, I started building a house. The house was a symbol of a new beginning for me, a place where I could find peace, away from all the ghosts of the past that enveloped my current world. I chose a town that was a decent distance away, far enough away that she had no way of easily reaching me. This place was to be my fortress, a refuge from her lies and betrayal. I didn't put it in my own name. I was careful, perhaps too careful, but I needed that precaution. I put the house in my sister's name, the only person I could trust at that moment. Everything was done in complete secrecy, so that neither my wife nor those who might be watching my steps would suspect that I was preparing the ground for my disappearance. I had thought of everything in detail, careful not to leave any trace. My face remained calm, my words without a shadow of suspicion. No one knew that in my head, like a complex mechanism, I was building a plan of escape, not a sudden one, with storms and loud scandals, but a quiet and cold one, when she would realize that I was no longer the one she had betrayed. During these 3 years, I did not just wait and wait, I acted. In the shadows, unnoticed by others, I was building my new life, stealing little by little, slowly but surely collecting funds for the future. They were small sums that did not attract attention, but in time they turned into considerable capital. I was careful, skillful, like a thief who knows all the ins and outs. The money that settled in secret accounts became for me the very foundation on which I planned to build my independence. I prepared this moment for a long time, thoughtfully, carefully checking every step, every action. I no longer cared about their feelings or their fates. I was absorbed only in my goal. Everything that happened within the walls of my house and at work seemed to me a waste of time, a stage set behind which another, much more important play was being played out. I was no longer a husband, a devoted father, or a co-worker. I was a hunter waiting for the moment when his trap would slam shut. And then the day came, the moment no one could have predicted. Everything went on as usual. Nothing gave away the impending blow. Outwardly, everything was familiar. I was still working on important projects, communicating with colleagues, exchanging duty phrases with my boss. But inside, I was seething with a sense of near triumph, the moment I had been planning all these long years. I was ready to strike the blow that would bring no return. My revenge was well thought out, cold-blooded, and precise, like a surgical incision. One day I took an expensive and promising project on which I had worked for many months and, without too much emotion, leaked it to competitors. The deal was quick, cold, and profitable for me. The competitors gladly accepted such a generous offer, not realizing that behind it was not just a commercial gain, but an act of personal revenge. The round sum I received as a result of this deal was not just money for me. It was a symbol of the final break with the past. But I didn't stop there. I knew too much about what went on behind the closed doors of our company. Over the years, I had witnessed a lot of gray schemes, dirty deals, and machinations that the bosses were so careful to hide from the outside world. And, as a final chord, I leaked all these details to the tax authorities. Every detail, every little thing, every shady scheme. All this I handed over to the authorities with cold calculation, knowing what a disaster it would turn out to be for them. No one expected this blow. It was done so quietly, that their world collapsed in an instant, without warning, like a sudden storm. When the firm was searched, everything happened quickly, almost instantly, as if lightning had struck the very heart of the company. Time seemed to stop when I saw the law enforcement officers coldly and unhesitatingly seize all the documentation, taking it out in packs in white plastic boxes. The faces of my colleagues were frozen in bewilderment and fear. Someone tried to explain something, to justify himself, but it didn't matter anymore. The ship was sinking and there was no escape. I watched with a silent satisfaction hidden behind a mask of anxiety. Outwardly, I looked as confused as the rest of them, but inside I was filled with a sense of absolute victory. My plan had come to fruition, and now all that remained was to watch everything they had spent so long building, so carefully concealing, crumble. But there was one more, the last scene of this play. A confession to the one that had destroyed our home long before these events. When I got home that day, my wife already knew. Her face was white as chalk, her eyes filled with fear and pain. She rushed toward me, barely had I crossed the threshold. Her hands clenched convulsively around my neck as if that gesture could make everything better. In her eyes, I could see the despair that gripped her soul as she realized that the fragile world she'd worked so hard to build in secret had finally crumbled. I stared at her, silent, cold, and in that moment all my restrained feelings found their way out. I opened up to her, told her everything about knowing everything from the beginning, about her affair with my boss, about how she'd ruined our life day after day while I'd watched in silence. I told her how I'd prepared my revenge, how step by step I'd brought their world down. With each word I spoke, her face grew more and more drained, as if these confessions were a dagger I was slowly plunging into her heart. She fell to her knees, unable to hold the mask any longer. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and her voice trembled like a hunted animal. She sobbed, almost choking, and through her sobs she said she was doing all this for us. She begged me to believe that she was disgusted with herself, that she despised herself for every step she took toward this vicious affair. Her voice, filled with despair, crumbled with her lies, and I stood before her as if watching the fall of some foreign, unknown woman. She said it was a sacrifice for our family, that she was trying to preserve everything we had accomplished, and that it confused her, dragged her into this maelstrom of betrayal. She begged for forgiveness, promised that everything could be brought back, that she was willing to make it right if only I would give her a chance. But her tears and words full of pleading did not resonate in my heart. At that moment, I realized that everything that had once been between us had burned to the ground. When it was time for the last move in my elaborate game, I realized that everything had to be brought to a conclusion. The cheating, the secret passion, the betrayals, all of it had to be revealed to those who remained in the shadows, to those who were still in the dark, including his wife. The woman who had lived beside him for years, perhaps as much as I did, had no idea that her husband, an aging and bankrupt man, was leading a double life. My revenge couldn't be complete without her finding out the truth. I leaked everything to her. Every detail, every sordid detail. I did it not for revenge against her personally, but to complete my plan, to destroy his world to the ground. His wife, who seemed calm and aloof, took the blow with her head held high. She didn't make a scene, didn't try to find out how or why it had happened. Her eyes expressed no tears, no pleading, no despair. It seemed that all of this was just the last straw for her, the final confirmation that her life with this man had long ago lost its meaning. When she'd learned of his affairs, of how he'd traded their lives for a fling with a woman who could have been his daughter, her heart hadn't flinched. She felt no affection for this old, bankrupt man who had long ago lost his importance in her eyes. Nothing held her close to him anymore, not the love that had long since faded, nor the years together that had turned to ashes. She had filed for divorce with cold determination, as if the act was the only possible end to their long, outlived marriage for her. His life crumbled the moment he realized he had lost everything: his wife, his business, and most importantly, his self-confidence, his power on which he had built his last years. A little time passed, and I learned that this man could not bear all the weight that had been heaped on him from all sides. His body, old and tired from violent passions, from constant playing with fire, could not bear such a blow. He became ill and was taken to the hospital, where he spent his last days, surrounded not by the care of his loved ones, but by the emptiness that grew more and more around him. Finally, his heart, exhausted by tension and stress, gave out. He died of a heart attack, unable to bear the burden he had created for himself. His death did not bring me joy, but I did not feel regret. It was just the inevitable outcome of the life he had chosen. Now my life had taken the shape I had dreamed of during those long years of waiting and calculating. Everything I had been building in secret, with cold patience, has finally come true. I have a home, quiet, cozy, far from the hustle and bustle of the past, in another city where no one knows the tangled history that was left behind. This house became my refuge, a place where I could find peace, a place where I could shut myself off from all the chaos that used to poison my existence. Next to me now is a woman with whom life turned out to be surprisingly calm and harmonious. Her name is Anna. She was an accountant in the very firm where it all began and where my old life ended. In her calculations, she was always pedantic and precise, but behind the strict figures there was a tenderness and care that I had not noticed before. We did not burden ourselves with the bonds of official marriage. The civil union was closer and clearer to both of us. She understands me without unnecessary words, and in her presence I feel the simplicity and sincerity that was so lacking in the past. I am no longer tied to the world of corporate intrigue and complex games. I now own a small auto parts store. This business doesn't bring in a huge amount of money, but I don't need more. Here, away from ambition and frustration, I find fulfillment in the simplicity of everyday life. The store is small, but profitable, stable, enough to provide us with everything we need. Working with the machines, with their parts and mechanisms, has even proved to be a kind of therapy. In these clear and simple mechanisms, there is no room for lies and betrayal. Everything is clear and transparent, just as I now want to see my life. My son lives with us. He is now 12 years old, and he is growing up to be a smart and intelligent boy. I see the way he looks at me, with respect and trust, and that feeling fills my soul with peace. We spend a lot of time together. I teach him everything I know, and I want his life to be free of the mistakes I made. Anna has become more than just a stepmother to him. She shows him genuine care and attention, and he, in turn, has been drawn to her more and more over the years. Their relationship develops naturally, without the strain and tension as it was with his mother. As for my ex-wife, she is still single. Time has passed, but no one has ever come into her life. Maybe her loneliness is the result of all the choices she once made. Or maybe she just couldn't deal with the consequences of destroying our home, destroying herself. I rarely think of her, though sometimes a shadow of a former life flickers in my thoughts, but it no longer causes pain or resentment. Once a month I send her a small amount of money. not to keep in touch or to nurture any feelings, just so that she doesn't starve to death. This modest sum is a reminder that life goes on, and even those who have made mistakes still have to get on with their lives. When I finally listened to everything she had to say, I asked, almost in a whisper, "Why would you do this to me?" My voice, thick with pain, barely broke the stillness between us, and in response, she broke down completely, her sobs turning into an uncontrollable wail. Between her tears, she confessed that she couldn't explain her actions, that it was an irrational, overwhelming passion, something she couldn't justify. There were no reasons, no rationales that could ease the weight of her betrayal. She told me that the choice now lay with me, and she swore, as if trying to cling to the last shreds of our broken bond, that if I could ever find it within me to forgive her, she would be faithful to me for the rest of her life. The first few days after that conversation were nothing short of a blur. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I moved through my days like a machine, mechanically going to work and returning home, only to collapse on the bed and stare blankly at the ceiling. I was engulfed in a fog of confusion, my mind ceaselessly churning through questions that had no answers. At night, I would wake up drenched in cold sweat, gasping for air, and drink water in desperate gulps, chain-smoking to try to calm the storm in my mind. Despite everything, I didn't touch alcohol. It felt like that would only drown me further into a void I was already teetering on the edge of. At work, colleagues began to notice the change in me. They asked, concern lacing their voices, "What's happened to you? You look different, like the life has been drained out of you." And indeed, I felt as though some invisible hand had sucked the very essence of me away. My wife, too, saw the toll her confession had taken on me. She was always crying, her eyes swollen and red, begging for my forgiveness. Yet I couldn't find the words to respond. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, it was as if something in my throat seized, and all I could do was remain silent, locked in a prison of my own thoughts. Time passed, and I often found myself on the verge of a conversation with her, a heart-to-heart, like the ones we used to have in the earlier days of our marriage. I wanted to tell her how much I still loved her, how deep the pain had cut, but no matter how many times I tried, I couldn't push past the lump in my throat. It felt as though my voice had abandoned me, as though the weight of the betrayal had silenced the very thing that once kept us connected. I was stuck, unable to move forward, yet unable to go back to the way things were. Half a year passed, and during that time, I found myself constantly reflecting on our life together, revisiting memories, searching for answers, as though some hidden truth would reveal itself if I only thought hard enough. I scrutinized every moment, every action, and eventually, I convinced myself that the fault lay within me. I began to believe that I had somehow failed her, that I had not done enough, or perhaps done too much of the wrong things. The guilt consumed me, eating away at my self-worth until there was little left but doubt. Over those months, I withdrew from her, not just emotionally but physically as well. The thought of intimacy with her didn't even cross my mind. In fact, I was afraid of it. It's difficult to explain, but a deep-seated fear took hold of me, a fear that I could no longer satisfy her, that perhaps I had never been enough. The idea of lying beside her in bed, as we once did, now filled me with a sense of inadequacy, of shame. I couldn't bear the thought of failing her again, so I avoided it entirely. Our conversations became shallow, limited to the mundane details of everyday life. We spoke of chores, schedules, and the needs of our daughter, but nothing deeper. My attention to our daughter remained unwavering, as though I sought to shield her from the storm that brewed beneath the surface of our home. She was entering the turbulent waters of adolescence, and I was determined that she not sense any of the cracks that had formed between her mother and me. It wasn't her burden to carry, and I wanted, more than anything, to spare her from the pain of realizing that her parents' once unshakable bond had been fractured. As time passed, the rawness of the emotions began to subside, and the ache in my heart softened, though it never fully disappeared. One day, in a moment of clarity, I realized it was time to have a real conversation with my wife. I couldn't live in the silence any longer. I sat her down, and for the first time in months, I spoke openly. I told her that I bore no ill will towards her, that I harbored no resentment. I confessed that I still loved her deeply, with the same intensity as I always had, and that I would go through fire and water for her. But I also admitted that something inside me had changed since the betrayal, though I couldn't yet put my finger on what it was. I told her I needed time to understand this shift, this transformation within me. In that moment, I asked her for a promise. I told her that if she ever felt that life with me wasn't what she wanted, if she ever felt unfulfilled or lost again, she must come to me immediately. There was no point in prolonging a life of dissatisfaction, no point in dragging each other through the motions when life, brief and fleeting as it is, could still unfold in a different way, perhaps even with another person. We became close again, but it was never quite the same. I tried, truly tried, to be the man I once was, the attentive husband, the loving partner, but something had shifted between us, irreversibly. In the privacy of our bedroom, strange and disconcerting problems with my potency began to surface, and with each instance, the frustration and self-doubt gnawed away at me like a relentless tide. I could feel the weight of it building, pushing me further into a corner I couldn't quite escape. And yet, life continued on, as it always does. Another 6 years passed by in what felt like the blink of an eye, and throughout it all, my family remained the single, unwavering priority in my life. I had stopped questioning whether she was unfaithful again. It wasn't out of trust, but rather resignation. She remained the same woman, a beautiful, intelligent, graceful presence in our home. She was a wonderful mother, an excellent homemaker, and, at least on the surface, a devoted wife. Yes, I had forgiven her, but somewhere deep inside, something had been broken beyond repair. It was as though her betrayal had scorched my very soul, leaving behind nothing but a desolate emptiness. It's hard to describe, but in many ways, I felt hollowed out. The fire that once burned so brightly within me had been extinguished, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't rekindle it. The fortress I had built around my heart, once so strong and impenetrable, had crumbled like a fragile house of cards, leaving me exposed and vulnerable in ways I had never imagined. And yet, there was no sense of renewal, no sense of a fresh beginning. The promise of something new, something better, that I had once clung to, had evaporated into the ether. Over time, I became a different person, a man transformed by the very thing I once thought I would never have to face. The true meaning of betrayal lies not in the act itself, but in its lasting aftermath, in the quiet yet profound ways it changes everything. I had changed that I often found myself reflecting, sometimes with a bittersweet smile, on those earlier days, the days when I wandered across distant lands, tirelessly working to build a future for my family. I could vividly recall the words scrawled across the side of my field pack, a simple phrase that I had adopted as a mantra in those early, lean years. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger. How ironic it seemed now. I had clung to that belief with every fiber of my being, believing in its truth as I faced hardship after hardship, all in the name of creating a life worth living. But now, years later, I couldn't help but wonder, had it made me stronger, or had it simply left me numb? Over time, something curious began to happen. I found myself no longer weighed down by that familiar, suffocating burden that had haunted me for so long. It was strange, almost surreal, this sudden shift in my being. I tried to make sense of it, to understand what had kept me tethered to the past, preventing me from altering the course of my life sooner. Yet, no matter how much I reflected, I could not find an answer. I had always been an optimist, a man who believed that things would eventually settle down, that time would smooth over the rough edges of life and restore some semblance of peace. And in a way it did. The storm had passed, but in its wake, something vital had disappeared, something I hadn't fully grasped until now. That essential piece of my soul, the very thing that had once given meaning to my existence and infused my marriage with purpose, had quietly slipped away. It was as though the driving force, the invisible thread that had pulled me forward through the years, had finally snapped. My sense of duty, that foolish responsibility I had clung to, told me for so long that I could not simply abandon everything and walk away. That would be an act of betrayal, of the vows I had made, of the family I had worked so hard to build. And yet, something had shifted within me. No, it wasn't betrayal, at least not in the way I had feared. It was as if, without warning, my perspective had changed, and the weight of everything that had happened no longer crushed me in the same way. I no longer felt like a traitor to my own life, nor to the woman beside me. One morning, as I awoke to the quiet stillness of our home, it hit me with a clarity I had not experienced in years. I was living a life that was not mine. I had been going through the motions, following a script that felt foreign, disconnected from the man I once was. It was as if I had been asleep, drifting through an existence that belonged to someone else. And now, as I lay there, looking at my wife, who slept peacefully beside me, I realized with a quiet finality that I no longer knew her. The face I had once adored, the person I had shared so many years with, now seemed distant, unfamiliar, as though she were a stranger lying in my bed. The woman before me, whose every expression I once could read like the pages of an intimate, well-worn book, now felt like a closed volume, a story whose meaning had eluded me. It wasn't anger or sorrow that filled me in that moment, but rather a sense of calm detachment. I felt as if I had crossed a threshold, one I hadn't even realized I was approaching. There was no longer any lingering resentment or bitterness. Instead, there was a quiet understanding that the life we had shared was not the life I wanted anymore. It wasn't who I was anymore. As I gazed at her, asleep and unaware of the changes within me, it became clear that my journey, whatever it was, had taken me far beyond the boundaries of our marriage. The realization was both liberating and sobering. I had always believed in endurance, in pushing through the hardships because that was what a man was supposed to do. But now I saw that endurance without purpose was empty, and it was this emptiness that had slowly consumed me, without my even knowing. That morning, I left the house with a peculiar sense of clarity. I turned off my phone, wanting to escape from the noise of the world, from everything that had bound me to my former self. I drove aimlessly through the city, pulling over at random spots on the side of the road, wandering through quiet stretches of forest. It's difficult to explain, but I felt a weight lifting, as if I were a bird that had finally broken free from its cage. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a lightness in my chest, a release that came from somewhere deep within. The mistakes I had made, the guilt I had carried, none of it seemed to matter anymore. It was as though I had paid my dues, and I felt no remorse for the newfound peace that settled over me. As I drove and reflected on everything that had led me to this moment, I began to understand the true extent of my freedom. It wasn't simply about leaving a relationship that had long since lost its meaning. It was about reclaiming a part of myself that I hadn't realized had been buried for years. By the time the day gave way to evening, my path seemed clearer than ever. I returned home, where my wife was waiting, and told her everything. What followed was a long conversation, but surprisingly, there were no accusations, no anger. She cried, of course, but it wasn't the kind of crying that demanded pity or forgiveness. It was the quiet, inevitable grief of someone who had been expecting this day all along. And strangely, I no longer felt any sympathy for her. Not in a cruel way, but in a way that made me realize how detached I had become from the life we once shared. With as much care as I could, I explained to her how I saw life now, what I had come to understand over the course of the last several months, maybe even years. She, in turn, shared her own perspective, as if she too had been waiting for the right moment to voice her truths. Again and again, she asked for forgiveness, as if seeking some final absolution from the past. I reassured her that I had forgiven her long ago, long before today, in fact, but I also told her that I was no longer the man she had once married. That man had ceased to exist a long time ago. We had spent almost 23 years together, 15 of them before what I now call the breaking point. During those years, I lived entirely for her and for our daughter, doing everything I could to be the husband and father they needed. But the next 8 years, those that came after the rupture in our marriage, felt like a blur. I couldn't even recall much of that time, as if it had passed in a haze. The days had blended together, filled with mundane routines and a lingering sense of disconnection. as I spoke to her. I realized that the life we had built, the home we had shared for over 2 decades, had become little more than a shadow of what it once was. There was no longer any purpose, no driving force behind our existence together. And perhaps the strangest part of it all was that I no longer felt sorrow for what had been lost. That too had faded, along with everything else. All this time, I never once reproached her. Every emotion, every betrayal, I lived through quietly within myself. Yet, over the course of those years, something fundamental shifted. My understanding, my attitude toward life, and our relationship transformed. It became clear to me that continuing the marriage was nothing more than a waste of time. Our daughter had grown, nearly ready to fly out of the nest, and my wife, I believe, had come to terms with the inevitable. She must have realized, as I had, that our paths had diverged long ago. For years, we had walked side by side, but only out of inertia, out of habit. To be fair, there were good moments too. While I was blissfully ignorant of what lay beneath the surface, I was genuinely happy. Those years before I knew the truth, before everything changed, were filled with a kind of peace. But that peace was built on a foundation that no longer existed. The moment I realized the depth of the lies that had unraveled our life together, everything else lost its meaning. We filed for divorce. I spoke with our daughter, explaining everything as delicately as I could. She's old enough now to understand, and thankfully, she did. We still see each other often, perhaps even more than I ever saw my wife in the final years of our marriage. Life moves forward, and the emptiness that once echoed so loudly within me has finally faded into silence. It no longer haunts me. I don't have a new woman in my life, nor do I seek one. The idea frightens me in ways I hadn't expected, and frankly, I don't want it. After everything, I've come to realize that there's a truth I can no longer ignore. What doesn't kill us outright doesn't always make us stronger. Sometimes, it leaves us wounded, damaged in ways we never fully recover from. It doesn't make us stronger. It makes us survivors, but perhaps not whole.